ICU.
Built in 1924, a historic 3-story building served as an auditorium and headquarters for the Fort Worth chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. But now, over 100 years later, this same facility is getting an extreme makeover. A group of North Texas nonprofits are collaborating to transform this red brick building into a cultural hub and safe space for the community.
The building that the Klan built, it is imposing. They built it to shock and to awe, and it really feels that way from the outside. I've been saying there's blood in the bricks.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and stay tuned as we speak candidly with one of the leaders of the 1012 North Main Street project, Daniel Banks. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. In the year 1921, white union butchers went on strike at a meatpacking plant in North Texas. Plant management moved to replace those white workers with blacks who were excluded from joining the union. Fred Rouse was one of those workers. According to published reports, during a heated union protest, Rouse was attacked, stabbed, and violently beaten nearly to death. Local police transported him to a hospital in downtown Fort Worth. Recovering in a segregated ward, Rouse spent several days in the hospital's basement. But an angry mob of white men sieged upon the hospital and dragged him out in his nightgown. News reports say he was strung up on a tree at the corner of Northeast 12th Street and Samuels Avenue in Fort Worth, his body riddled with bullets. Ultimately, no one was held responsible for his death, and that hackberry tree where Rouse was hung was cut down to prevent further lynchings at that spot. Just 3 years after the lynching of Fred Rouse, construction began on the Ku Klux Klan Clavern No. 101's auditorium, an imposing building just a mile from the county courthouse. The auditorium was a daily reminder of power and politics of the Klan. Make no mistake, the KKK of the 1920s was all about lynching and shooting and thrashing of blacks, also Jews, Catholics, Latinos, and any immigrant deemed unwelcome. This auditorium also hosted racist, sexist, and anti-immigrant minstrel shows. As the Klan was pushed into the shadows, this building was sold, and for many years was the site of a pecan shelling company. It sat empty since 1999, but local artists and nonprofit organizations are now working to transform this massive space into a community center and arts hub. The building will now be known as the Fred Rouse Center for Arts and Community Healing. Daniel Banks is a board member of Transform 1012 North Main Street, a collective of 8 North Texas nonprofit groups that all came together for this project. We're pleased to have him join us on ICU to talk about this amazing initiative. Daniel Banks, thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Thanks, Eddie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Daniel, first off, I want to learn and know, how did this initial idea come about? How did you directly become involved in this project in the first place? Go.
My husband and I moved to Fort Worth, Texas in 2016.
Okay.
He was hired as a tenure-track professor at TCU, at Texas Christian University, in the dance program. Prior to that, we were in New York City, which is where we started our company, DNA Works. When we got to Fort Worth, Adam was doing some research about lynchings in North Texas and in Texas, and came across the name Mr. Fred Rouse, who is a black man and butcher and father who was lynched by a white mob in 1921 in Fort Worth. And it's the only documented lynching in Fort Worth of a black man in Fort Worth, meaning that there were 3 corroborative sources that were like newspapers. But of course, I think we all understand, and certainly we've actually met people in this process who've talked about family members who were lynched that are not considered, right, officially recognized. In the process of researching Mr. Fred Rouse and his life and his death, Adam discovered that there was this building on North Main Street, not a mile from County Courthouse, and that it was constructed in 1924 by the Fort Worth chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, Claveren 101. It was built as an auditorium. It was also built as the Texas headquarters for the KKK. And we drove by the building and we looked at it, and it is a huge, imposing red brick building at the gateway from downtown to the north side, which is historically and still a Hispanic, Black, and immigrant neighborhood district. And it was immediately clear to us several things. One, this was the Klan's way of saying, we're in charge, we're watching you. Because if you were coming from the north side in or out of downtown, you had to pass by that building. And secondly, our immediate response was, this has to become a center for arts and community healing. And we also understood immediately, because we were taught by our parents to be good guests. We understood immediately that as newcomers to Fort Worth, this couldn't be a DNA Works project. This was far bigger than DNA Works. We just knew that this had to be something bigger. This had to be a city project. This had to be a community project. So one of our first meetings was with Council Member Carlos Flores, whose district the building is in. Again, one of our first meetings was with Dr. Opal Lee, the grandmother of Juneteenth.
Who's been a guest on ICU.
Wonderful, who is a celebrity, and rightly so, just an extraordinary friend and leader and visionary and activist. And we began to think about how it would look to have this be coalition-led rather than led by a small number of people, led by a larger number of people, all of whom served and represented the communities that were targeted by the KKK at that time. And so just to name our communities, it's Black, Hispanic, Catholic, LGBTQ, Jewish, and immigrant communities. And so we brought together 8 organizations and entities, and we began meeting in 2019 to see if this would work.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and you're listening to ICU. We're speaking with Daniel Banks, co-founder of DNA Works and Transform 1012 North Main Street. It's a nonprofit coalition of local arts, grassroots, and service organizations, all working to redefine a former headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan in Fort Worth, Texas, into a cultural safe space. Were city officials and council members in the region cooperating at first with the repurposing?
The support out the gate was overwhelmingly supportive, and not only from city politicians, but from a wide range of faith leaders, of grassroots activists, of family members associated with the organizations that were part of our coalition. And of course, there was some explaining to do about what we meant by a Center for Arts and Community Healing. I think some folks, because Fort Worth, I would say for the size of city that it is, it does not have as many performing arts organizations as most cities of this size would have. And so I think people were a little confused as to what did it mean to be doing performing arts in that building, and what kind of performing arts would they be doing? And I think one person said to me, I really don't see Annie being done in that building. And we're like, no. Casa Mañana's got that. Right. That's their, we're not going to step on their territory. That's their territory. Like, we're thinking about something very, very different in terms of what it means social justice performing arts looks like.
When deciding on what the space would be used for, were each of the elements decided on by community members? Was it tailored for the community? How did all that come about in terms of what the direction of this building would take?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. yes, it was all determined based on what we heard in our, if you will, listening tour. I think Adam and I did a listening tour of about 2,000 people before we even brought the coalition together. So we heard what the needs were. We heard what people were saying the needs of the North Side were. We knew what the needs of the performing arts community was in terms of opportunities for early career directors and choreographers and mentorship opportunities. We knew that there were food deserts throughout the city, but specifically in the North Side. We knew that small and micro business owners needed support and incubation and mentorship for their projects. And we also understood, because when we first moved to Fort Worth, DNA Works came to work at this wonderful co-working space, shout out Ensemble Co-working. And we thought if we could replicate that on a kind of a live-work model with affordable housing for artists and entrepreneurs and residents, and there could be that kind of ecosystem where they're feeding each other. The artists are bringing their creativity and their imaginativity and their out-of-the-box thinking, and entrepreneurs are bringing their understanding of business and finance and fundraising. And we were all together under the auspices of this project. That seemed like something that could really benefit any city, and especially Fort Worth. And so that's where the ideas came from, was from people telling us what they needed that they weren't getting in Fort Worth.
Describe, as people are listening to you, kind of give us some insight on like the property. What does it look like? And not only that, how did you feel, right? Going inside of this structure, I'm sure there's, if these walls could talk, cliches all abound. Right. But just kind of give our audience some insight on what the property looks like and how you felt once you walked into this incredible, massive building.
The building that the Klan built is a 22,000 square foot floor plate, 3-story, almost entirely brick with big window structure. It is imposing. It is, they built it to shock and to awe, and it really feels that way from the outside. The first feeling of walking in that space is a visceral energy. There is unmistakably a visceral energy. If you blindfolded someone and took them in there and unblindfolded and tell them what it was and said, what do you think this building is? I don't think anyone would just be like, a warehouse. I've been saying there's blood in the bricks. And one of the places that I immediately thought of that gave me a similar feeling was when Adam and I visited the Cape Coast Castle on the coast of Ghana in West Africa, which is one of the places from which kidnapped Africans were sold into this state called slavery. And the I guess you would say the dungeon level, really, which is where people were kept in very inhumane conditions, had that same feeling of uncomfortable vibration, energy, just knowing what had happened there. And literally they tell you when you're there that the ground and the floor, one can imagine what that is composed of, with thousands of people having passed through there and been held in captivity there. So there is a vibration about the space, and actually we are planning, prior to construction, we're planning a blessing ceremony of the space, and then prior to opening, we are planning a healing, smudging, consecration of the space.
Coming up, our chat continues with Daniel Banks, one of the organizers leading an effort to transform a former KKK headquarters in Fort Worth into a new cultural hub and performance venue for the community. Why do you think this building was never demolished? What gave the architect at the time the audacity to build a Ku Klux Klan headquarters in this region in the first place? And why are youth and young adults becoming more active in this project? I'm Eddie Robinson. A captivating discussion takes place in ICU's second segment. Don't move. We'll be right back. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're spending the hour talking about a building in Fort Worth, Texas. A building that Daniel Banks describes as having blood in the bricks. A headquarters and auditorium built by the Ku Klux Klan in 1924. The KKK back then was mainstream. Quote-unquote respectable politicians and businessmen were members. The KKK still embraced violence and even murder. Daniel, it seems hard to believe that this all could be so accepted, right? As I hear the story and hear you describe all this, to think that someone actually commissioned the space back in the 20s and gave it a green light. KKK headquarters here, your local post office there, a grocery store here. It's just amazing to me to think that someone actually said, build this building right here, and this would be great to have in this town.
Well, I think we have to do a mind shift and understand what the atmosphere was in the 20s. Right. The KKK, so this was not the post-emancipation Reconstruction KKK of Birth of a Nation.
The Birth of a Nation sparked a revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The Klan's ideology of white supremacy and what they called 100% Americanism resonated across the country.
The Klan of the 1920s was not a rural Klan, which the Klan of Reconstruction had primarily been. The Klan of the 1920s was very big in surprising places like Denver, like Portland, Detroit, which had huge waves of immigration, both of Catholics from Europe and of African Americans coming from the South.
This was an era, oftentimes historians talk about 3 eras of the KKK, and we're in the 3rd era still. The second era was one of it really being like a fraternal organization. There was not a lot of secrecy about it. There were law enforcement officers, judges, businessmen, bankers, college professors, college presidents. I mean, this is where the leaders of Fort Worth and their families gathered. There are also advertisements that were posted in the paper about social activities and dances and performances that happened on that stage. There were minstrel shows that happened on that stage. And we know the name of the architect, Earl Glasgow, who was a very well-known architect in the region. There's a school not far from the building I believe it's a middle school that he designed as well. And so this was business as usual. Now, the historians that we've consulted have explained to us that the KKK actually across the country, did not actually build a lot of buildings. They mostly took over spaces. And if you Google adaptive reuse of KKK buildings or KKK adaptive reuse, you'll find cinemas, you'll find warehouses, and I mean they just took over spaces, right? Elks Lodges or whatever the group was. And so what is unique about this building is that it was a new build, is the term that we've learned in our work on this project is it was a purpose-built building. And it may in fact be, and I don't like to always say the only one, even though that's what people have said to us, because there's always exceptions to every rule. So we've been saying it is most likely one of the last, if not the last, purpose-built headquarters or meeting halls, auditoriums of the KKK that hasn't been demolished.
Wow.
So then why save it and why not demolish it, given its history?
I'm sure some people were basically coming at you and saying, I'm sorry, you two gentlemen who come into my home, I want to forget all about this. They're rocking in their rocking chair. Demolish it. Destroy this building. Why are you doing this? How did you respond to those kinds of comments?
Sure. We had the full range of comments. We had people who immediately said, this is amazing. You're flipping the script on history. You're redistributing resources that were taken from communities and giving them back to communities. We call it a reparative justice project. And then, of course, there were people who were like, it's too painful. Mm-hmm. It should be demolished. Even just seeing it is a painful memory, let alone the possibility of walking into the building. Mm-hmm. And our response to, and of course, our job is to listen. Okay. But if there is an opportunity for dialogue, our response is to ask people to consider that you can't heal from trauma by ignoring it. The trauma only grows within one's psyche and consciousness, and I would say physiology. Now that we know that there's epigenetic memory and that trauma is passed down genetically, if we do not heal from the trauma, it only grows bigger. And it only becomes more of a problem in our lives. And so again, this is also understood from indigenous communities to modern human science, and some of it is machine science, but we know that trauma needs to be processed and dealt with. You can only go through it to get to the other side. And so what became important was sharing a clear vision, as we talked about a little bit before, correct, of how this building will provide resources, of how this building will provide an opportunity for healing, of how learning about the history will be part of a process of ensuring that it does not repeat itself, and that by sweeping it under the carpet only gives people permission to do the same things over and over again. And I'm not saying that everybody was convinced. I think there are still some people who feel like, well, that's all well and good, but I'm still not going to go there. Mm-hmm. I will say that having advocates like Dr. Opal Lee has been very helpful, and the fact that she is so firmly behind it and speaks so passionately about, one of her great quotes is, if you can be taught to hate, you can be taught to love.
What I say to young people, and anybody as a young person, if they're not 95, I tell them it's left up to you to change somebody's mind, and their minds can be changed. Those people who are angry and want to hate, they can be changed so that they love people. And what I say is, if you know one of them, and they seem to be a lot of them, let's change their minds.
And to have a space and an opportunity for all of our groups to come together, all of our groups that were harmed by the KKK, and some of us who cause harm to each other because of the harm and the trauma done to us, because we know that hurt people hurt others, for us to come together and heal collectively from that trauma so that we can actually repair relationships with one another and hold each other in that love and learn to love one another the way that Dr. Opal says, is too big an opportunity to miss. And the other thing that some of the folks involved with this project and some community members have said, which I think is really wise, is that while there are some people who feel that it is too painful might be too painful to come and see a performance or a lecture or come to an event in that space, the younger generation in Fort Worth has really latched onto this building and this project. We have a youth council, which was very important that the youth of Fort Worth have an equal voice and vote on the board as each one of our organizations. And they have all said, these young folks that have been involved have all said, this is our future. Jacora Johnson, who was the first sort of founder of that youth council, a student at TCU, really spoke so beautifully about how this is a building that will serve the next generations and the next generations, and that they will be inheriting that building.
I think our elders have a tendency to kind of leave us out of these conversations and make all of these decisions without us kind of leaving us in the dust. But we're going to be the ones taking care of the building, maintaining the building, inviting folks to this space, getting the word out about these things when this place is vibrant and popping.
And so my thought is also that once young folks are, for instance, Sol Ballet Folklorico, which is one of the founding organizations, once their students and their young people are performing in that space, of course their family members are going to want to come and see them perform. And so this is the thing about trauma, is one theory of healing from trauma is that if you can replace those bad memories and those bad experiences with good memories and good experiences, that is one way to heal, because you actually substitute and can dissolve that hurt with good experiences. So there's a lot of levels, there's a lot of dynamics. Like I said, it's our job to listen to people, not to try to convince people of anything. And also there has been I think a shift in some folks about what the nature of this project is and what the potential for this project is.
I'm Eddie Robinson. This is ICU. We're chatting with Daniel Banks of the organization known as Transform 1012 North Main Street in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm curious to find out if there's been any family members that were a part of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, have you ever come across any of those individuals? Go!
It's such a great question, because in fact, I was at a performance in New York talking to a friend of mine that I hadn't seen in 15 or more years about this project. And I was sitting on the aisle, she was sitting next to me, and the man sitting next to her leaned over and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt what is clearly a very deep and personal conversation, but my family is from the region, and we recently learned as a family that our elders were members of the Klan." And he said, "I've been looking for an opportunity, and I've been looking for a way for us to make amends and do relationship repair." And he said, I'd be honored if I could do anything to support your efforts. On the other side of the coin, when we were in Houston, Adam and I were in Houston at Project Row Houses. Shout out Project Row Houses.
Shout out. Yes.
When we were at Project Row Houses with a piece, actually that piece that we were creating when we got the tweet in front of the building called Shelter in Place.
Shelter in Place is an artwork by Adam McKinney that he made in collaboration with Roma Flowers, who's a dance film artist, Daniel Bank, Will Wilson, who's a tintype photographer, and Najib Sabour, who did the music for this piece. The piece references the life of Fred Rouse, who was killed in a lynching in Fort Worth, Texas in 1921.
And somebody came in to look at it. Project Row Houses, for folks who don't know, is a series of literal row houses that get turned into galleries that are free and open to the public. And the topic was critical race theory, of course. Excellent, wonderful programming. And somebody came in and said, you know, my girlfriend asked me to come in, and I didn't know anything about this, but I have a relative, I think it was an uncle or great uncle, who was lynched in Fort Worth, and it's not in the history books and nobody talks about it.
What was your reaction when you learned of the history of Fred Rouse, you know, and his lynching? You know, can you give us some insight there as to Fred Rouse? And I think on some level you're working with members of his family as well on this project.
We are working with members of his family. We were introduced early on to Fred Rouse III, Mr. Fred Rouse's grandson. And without telling their story, what we came to understand was that he and his siblings did not know the history of their grandfather.
Interesting.
And have learned more about that history through this process. There's a partner organization called Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice, which is a community partner of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. Adam co-founded that organization here in Fort Worth, and Fred Rouse III is now the president of that organization. That organization has acquired the site of the lynching and is turning it into a memorial space that has been beautifully designed by Design Jones. Fred III also serves on the Transform 1012 North Main Street board. And so he was the first board member that we brought on who was not part of the original coalition. But as soon as we met him and connected with his family, we brought him on the board. We invited him to join the board. He graciously accepted to represent his family and his family's interests on the board because, in fact, the name of the building will be the Fred Rouse Center for Arts and Community Healing and the Fred Rouse Memorial are less than a mile apart from one another as the crow flies, and they will be part of a kind of de facto memorial district. There's also the Frederick Douglass Park, which has since been paved over and kind of forgotten about by some, but not all people. And that forms a triangle with these two buildings, and they're all in the same general area in Fort Worth. And so this project and its sort of ancillary projects have revealed or surfaced many, many stories from all sides of the color line. One of the things that we also talk about whenever we talk about this in public is the history of Hispanic folks being lynched by the KKK, which is not necessarily what one immediately thinks about when one thinks about lynching and the KKK, but is also very much a part of Texas history and needs to be not forgotten.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like all of this will be coming to fruition when? Can you give us an idea as to the construction process for the building? When will we see a grand opening? Perhaps even is there a website that people can go to just kind of get some insight and status on this Transform 1012 North Main Street project?
The timeline working backwards is we anticipate opening by the end of 2025, which will actually be the 100th anniversary of the current iteration of the building. So as I mentioned, the building was built in 1924. Within, I believe it was approximately 6 months, there was a major fire to the upper level of the building, and the building had to be rebuilt. And there's been some back and forth between the historians about was the second version larger or smaller. Our engineering team, shout out to Spa Glass Engineering, Construction Management, they have identified based on the bricks that were used in the upper level and the changes that were made to the building that they could tell were obviously in the second iteration because they still are still there. They could tell that actually the building was bigger in the second iteration of the building. So breaking news, historians. This is from the engineers, and so that new version, or the 2.0, was opened in 1925. So when we open, I guess you could say the 3.0 version. There have been so many different uses of the building since then. When we open in 2025, that will be the centenary of the current structure.
Coming up, we wrap up our chat with Daniel Banks, one of the founding members of a major collaborative working to transform a former KKK building headquarters in North Texas into a cultural hub for the community. What challenges are they confronting with this project, and how is it being funded? Plus, we learn more about how this initiative has had an impact on Daniel and his family. What will it take to not only build, but transform a structure with such a painful history into a cultural center, a safe space, a performance venue for those who were excluded and shut out for over a century? I'm Eddie Robinson. Our final segment comes your way right after these messages. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. This is ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We're here with Daniel Banks. He's the co-founder and co-artistic director of DNA Works, an arts and service organization based in Fort Worth, Texas. The group is dedicated to dialogue and healing through the arts, specifically engaging in topics of representation, identity, and heritage. He's taken that dedication into a project of collaborating with dozens of organizations, community stakeholders, and political leaders to transform a space originally built for hate, a former KKK headquarters that hosted racist, sexist, and anti-immigrant minstrel shows and theatrical performances, into a community center and arts hub for Black, Latino, immigrant, Jewish, and LGBTQ+ community members. Daniel, can you describe for us the challenges, the roadblocks that you and your team have come across, where you even weren't sure if this was even going to come to fruition, that this initiative was going to happen?
I have to say, with all humility, the wind has been at our back. We moved slowly and mindfully so that we could take the time to listen, so that we could take the time to collaborate. And I think if we hadn't done that, we would have had many more challenges. And in fact, I don't even think the project would have been possible, because that is one of the things in DNA Works that involves trauma and difficult narratives and trying to create narrative change around different forms of oppression, racism, homophobia, all of the oppressions. We understand that working slowly is healing. And so it not only gives the artists or the organizers an opportunity to heal, but it gives the people with whom we're interacting an opportunity to process, breathe. We actually start, I think, almost all of our meetings and presentations with taking a breath and breathing. So the opportunities have been to introduce people to a different way of working that is that foregrounds process, that privileges process over product. We knew it was going to be really important to walk our talk, and that this mission had to trickle out to every aspect of this project. First, we put together a values policy, which we circulated to any potential service providers that we wanted to work with. And we made sure that they were in agreement with our values before jumping on board as a partner, as an organizational partner. Sense. And we put together a gift policy that very clearly lays out who we will and who we will not accept funding from. But we are not compromising our values to receive a significant gift from, let's say, a corporate entity that has not demonstrated that it treats our constituencies well, respectfully, humanely. So these are some of the things. And I remember when in Carlos's final interview for the executive director position, and everything was going great, and we were clear that we wanted to work with him. And I said, now I just want to warn you, we're actually probably going to make your job a little more difficult, because there may be some money that you want to bring in that we won't accept. And I also said, and we are not going to do naming rights. We might call our various spaces something else, but it won't be for a donor's name. And I said, it might be for an activist's name or a community leader or organizer's name, but it's not going to be a donor who gets their name on the theater or on the meeting room. And so I said, I don't know if you're going to work with us, because we're going to make your job a little bit harder. And I want you to know that now up front. And he said something so beautiful. And I think it was to the extent of, and Carlos, forgive me if I'm misquoting you, but I believe what he said was, it makes me want to work with you all the more. So that just gives you an idea, so I wouldn't necessarily call those challenges. I would say that we knew that we had to rewrite the rules, and we had to find the people for whom the new rules made sense and excited them, and that they were actually excited to try something new. I mean, God bless the projects group, who's our project management group, and John Stevenson. I feel like every week, he says, well, so the next step is, and I'm like, yeah, what if we tweaked that a little bit? And what if we did it this way instead of that way? And what if we use this language instead of that language? And we're constantly evolving our language too, that we're constantly finding better ways to talk about who we are and not use colonial language to describe ourselves. I mean, we certainly don't use the term minority, especially given that Fort Worth is a global majority city. So we don't, we challenge whenever anyone uses the term minority. We avoid words like underprivileged or marginalized, because that's not someone's ontological state. That's not who we are as people. That's things that have been done to us. And then even there was a period of time where we were talking about under-resourced communities, but that actually doesn't take into account the fact that we have resources. We have cultural resources. We have historical resources. We're just talking about money. We're talking about the redlining, really. So we started then using the term redlining, because that's in fact what it is if you're being, if communities are being deprived of resources, of economic resources, then that's redlining. And now we're starting to talk about ourselves, and especially our youth, as resilient, not as underinvested, not as under anything, but as resilient. No matter which culture, all of our cultural groups, we come from resilient communities. And so again, that hasn't been so much a challenge as it's been an opportunity to put the microscope on every brick, right? Every brick of our process, and make new choices that lead to freedom. I always quote the great poet Sonia Sanchez from the Black Arts Movement, who is still with us blessedly, and is really an elder in the community and inspiration to me. And one of her early plays, the title of the play is But How Do It Free Us? And that's sort of DNA Works' lens through which we make all decisions, and I've introduced that to the Transform 1012 board as well. Every decision, but how do it free us?
I believe that when my grandfather gave up his life with his last breath, he spoke into the wind and he said, "This is only the beginning." And they thought they killed the name Fred Rouse. They thought they killed the man Fred Rouse. But 100 years later, Fred Rouse came back in the form of me. His blood came back, not on the ground, but in a body. And his name, everything still lives on.
You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Daniel Banks, who's working to convert a former Ku Klux Klan headquarters into a community center and arts hub in Fort Worth, Texas. I wanted to get more insight on you and your life. I mean, how have you managed to keep your eyes on the prize, right? I mean, what really has motivated your passion for this kind of work?
Well, my parents named me Daniel, so I was going to be doing something with justice. The name Daniel literally means God's judge. And my family is definitely one that has always been about change and healing and justice. And I've certainly experienced my fair share of discrimination and injustice. So I'm always pivoting. As a young actor in college, I was told that I would never make it commercially because I was too ethnic looking. And so I pivoted to directing so that I could give opportunities to other actors who were being treated the way that I was being treated, or that was I was being told was my future. So I just, I don't know that that this was a choice. This is just what my journey has been. I was fortunate to know two of my great grandmothers and all four of my grandparents, and know them well, and know their struggles, and know, I mean, they essentially all came to this country as refugees, and stories that I heard, horrible stories of violence, of discrimination. And so I carry them with me. Not a day goes by where I don't think about them. And I don't think about what they taught us. Some more literally than others, but just what they taught us through their being. So I'm very, and I've been blessed to have amazing mentors and amazing teachers who have also taught me so much. The reason I went to grad school, because as an artist, I never thought I would go to grad school, is I met Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote Decolonizing the Mind.
But the mind is affected much more than just the economic materiality. Yeah, in a sense that there's a tendency for such societies to look for validation from the West. In other words, sometimes the initiatives from within the country are not valued, but if the same initiatives are kind of applauded in European capitals, then people have a tendency to say, oh, that's good, you know.
And as I was reading his book, I was like, oh my God, how do you know my childhood? how do you know what happened in my kindergarten classroom? We just met. You know, and the whole book like just laid out my entire life from start to finish, even into grad school, of the different forms of violence and aggression and power that people wield in education and cultural life and political life. And I just have been so fortunate to work with the most spiritually and intellectually inspiring people. I could sit here and just tell you all the people on whose shoulders I stand. That's how I do it, is that I'm doing it with their presence and with their hands on my back, moving the project forward.
Well, you know, as you venture into this new restorative project and look forward to what it will bring to the community, the energy and the compassion it has to inspire a region, a southern city that has a history entrenched in racism and discrimination, to know that you're playing a direct part, you know, in helping people and future generations with healing and recovery, even on a note relating to the notion of a reawakening, a rebirthing, so to speak. You know, I'm most excited for you, and this is remarkable work that your team is doing. And so with that being said, Daniel, of all the accomplishments that you've made, of all that you've had to endure in getting this project up and running, Daniel, what life lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
I really think that this taking it slow thing has gotten, I mean, it was something I was already thinking about playing with pre-COVID. And then this, you know, the majority of this, the early days of this project happened during COVID, keep in mind. And I think that just really solidified, because, you know, I was born in New York. I lived in New York for many years. I was fast. I was like, gotta get it done now. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, it's not happening.
I lived there for 20 years.
God,
I know, yeah.
Right. You know, like that's, and something shifted in me, the joy of just slowing it all down and taking it slowly and taking it moment by moment. And also, I'll just share, the woman who introduced Adam and me and actually ended up marrying us, Yavila McCoy, said something actually on a trip to Fort Worth, that at which she was speaking in a synagogue in Fort Worth. She said, it is our job to create spaces for people to fall in love with one another. And I think that just that simple statement, which through our story circle processes, through, I feel like we've always been doing that, but when somebody just sort of names the thing, right? And you're like, oh, that's what we're doing. And to also keep that along with Sonia Sanchez's wise words, Yavila's words. I think what I've really learned about myself is it just comes down to those two things. Like, uncomplicate it. Take as much away as possible. One of the things I talk with people about when I lead sessions on group facilitation and community organizing is don't give them more than they can hold in one hand. Like, if you're giving instructions to the room, don't give them more than they can hold. And so I think I have really clarified for myself over this time that those are the two things that I hold in my hand is, but how do it free us? And creating spaces for people to fall in love with one another.
He's one of the leaders of the Transform 1012 North Main Street project out in Fort Worth and co-founder of DNA Works. Daniel Banks, thank you tremendously for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you, Eddie. Appreciate you.
Our team includes Technical Director Todd Holzlander, producers Laura Walker and Micho Jacob. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Visit us at iseeushow.org for more about this week's episode and links to our social media channels. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen and download your favorite shows. Search for ISEEU Show with Eddie Robinson. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.